A shocking trial. A son accusing his own mother. A truth that no one saw coming. Nathan Sullivan, a young prosecutor, walks into the courtroom determined to convict one person, his mother, Margaret Sullivan. He believes she has committed fraud, stealing money from his late father's insurance policy. But the moment the trial begins, everything changes. Margaret doesn't deny the money was taken. Instead, she drops a bombshell. Nathan's father is alive. What follows is a gripping legal battle, where lies unravel, alliances shift, and the real criminal is revealed. As the truth unfolds, Nathan is forced to question everything he thought he knew. Who is truly guilty? And when justice is finally served, will it bring closure or only more pain? Stay until the end for a final twist you won't see coming. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching from. The court was in session. The prosecutor, a rising star named Nathan Sullivan, stood at the front of the courtroom, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden table. His opponent, his own mother. "Mrs. Sullivan," Nathan began, his voice sharp, "do you deny that after my father, Robert Sullivan, was declared dead, you continued receiving life insurance payments in his name?" His mother, Margaret, remained composed in the defendant's chair. "I do not deny that the payments were made," she said calmly, "but I never claimed them for myself." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge tapped his gavel. "Order in the court." Nathan pressed on. "Then who did?" Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You assume Robert Sullivan is dead." The air in the courtroom shifted. The jury exchanged confused looks. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you suggesting that your husband, who was legally declared dead 5 years ago, is still alive?" Margaret folded her hands. "I am not suggesting it, Your Honor. I am stating it as a fact." Nathan's breath caught in his throat. This was impossible. His father had died in a tragic car accident. There was proof, wasn't there? His opposing counsel, a seasoned defense attorney named Eleanor Carter, stood. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit new evidence to the court." Nathan clenched his jaw as Eleanor handed the judge a sealed envelope. The judge opened it, scanning the contents before his eyes widened slightly. He turned toward Nathan. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge said slowly, "this appears to be a notarized statement from a private investigator confirming that Robert Sullivan is alive and well in Mexico." A gasp spread through the courtroom like wildfire. The jury whispered among themselves. Nathan felt his world tilt. "No," he muttered. "That is not possible." Margaret finally looked at her son with something resembling pity. "Oh, Nathan," she said softly, "you were so busy trying to convict me you never stopped to ask if your father was really gone." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order. This court will take a recess. We will reconvene in 30 minutes." Nathan barely heard him. His mind raced. If his father was alive, then who had faked his death? And why? More importantly, had Nathan just accused the wrong person? Nathan Sullivan stood frozen as the courtroom emptied for recess. The judge had called for a break, but his mind refused to rest. His own mother had just told the court that his father, dead for 5 years, was actually alive. He stormed out of the courtroom and into the hallway, his heart pounding. His mother, Margaret, sat calmly on a wooden bench near the entrance, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he approached. "You lied to me," Nathan hissed, keeping his voice low. "My entire life, you let me believe Dad was gone." Margaret let out a small sigh. "I never lied, Nathan. I just never told you everything." Nathan clenched his fists. "That's the same thing." His mother met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "If I had told you, what would you have done?" "I would have." Nathan stopped. "What would he have done?" Margaret nodded, as if reading his hesitation. "Exactly. You were just a boy when your father disappeared. I did what I had to do to protect you." Before Nathan could respond, A voice interrupted them. "The court will resume in 5 minutes," said Eleanor Carter, Margaret's defense attorney, as she approached. She looked between them with an amused smirk. "I assume we're ready to continue?" Margaret stood gracefully. "I am." Nathan exhaled sharply, trying to regain control. "Then I hope you're ready to tell the truth." They returned to the courtroom, where the judge banged his gavel to call the session back to order. "Mrs. Sullivan," Nathan said as he stepped toward the witness stand, "let's start again. If my father is alive, then why did you let everyone believe he was dead?" Margaret folded her hands. "Because he wanted us to." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Nathan scoffed. "Are you telling this court that my father faked his own death?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." The jury shifted in their seats. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. Nathan shook his head in disbelief. "Why would he do that?" Margaret inhaled deeply. "Because he was drowning in debt, Nathan. He made bad investments. Owed people money he couldn't pay back. He saw only one way out: disappearing." Nathan swallowed hard. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. "You expect me to believe that my father abandoned us?" he asked. Margaret's lips pressed together. "Believe what you want, Nathan. But I didn't." "Steal a single cent." "The money from his insurance policy? It went exactly where he intended for you." The words hit Nathan like a brick. "What?" Margaret nodded. "He forged documents, made sure the insurance money would go to me, so I could take care of you." Nathan's mind reeled. Had he spent all these years resenting the wrong parent? The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Sullivan, do you wish to continue your questioning?" Nathan hesitated. His entire case had been built on the assumption that his mother was guilty. But now he wasn't sure who the real criminal was. Margaret watched him carefully. "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine, Nathan. But if you want to keep fighting me in this court, go ahead." Nathan stared at her, unsure of what to do next. The trial was far from over. Nathan sat at the prosecutor's table, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. Everything he had believed was unraveling before him. His father, Robert Sullivan, had faked his death. His mother, Margaret, had hidden the truth. And now, standing in this courtroom, Nathan found himself unsure of who he was even fighting against. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Sullivan, do you wish to continue with your case?" Nathan hesitated. The case he had spent months preparing was slipping through his fingers. He had walked into this court convinced his mother had committed fraud. Now, it seemed, she had only protected a lie someone else had created. His silence lingered too long. Margaret's defense attorney, Eleanor Carter, seized the opportunity. She stood and smoothed her blazer. "Your Honor," Eleanor began, "the prosecution's entire case rests on the assumption that my client committed fraud. However, new evidence suggests that the real perpetrator of this deception is Robert Sullivan himself." The judge nodded. "Do you have proof of this claim?" Eleanor smiled. "We do." She turned toward the courtroom doors. "And I would like to call a witness who can confirm it." The doors swung open, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He carried a briefcase and had the calm, calculating demeanor of someone used to exposing the truth. Nathan's stomach dropped as Eleanor introduced him. "Your Honor, this is Detective Samuel Pierce, a private investigator who has been tracking Robert Sullivan for the last 5 years." The tension in the courtroom thickened as Detective Pierce approached the stand and took his oath. Eleanor wasted no time. "Detective, can you tell the court where Robert Sullivan is now?" Pierce nodded. "Yes. Robert Sullivan has been living in Mexico under the alias James Rowe." Gasps rippled through the jury and the spectators. Nathan felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. "And," Eleanor continued, "can you confirm that Robert Sullivan has been withdrawing money from offshore accounts using forged documentation?" "Yes," Pierce said. "He has been siphoning money from various insurance policies, including the one he left in Margaret Sullivan's name." Nathan's breath caught. His father hadn't just run away. He had orchestrated an elaborate fraud, one that implicated his own family. Margaret sat quietly, her face unreadable. She had known all of this, Nathan realized. She had protected him from it. Eleanor turned to Nathan with an almost sympathetic look. "Would you like to cross-examine the witness?" Nathan hesitated. He felt like an outsider in his own case. What could he even ask? He had come into this court believing his mother was guilty, only to discover his father was the true criminal. He stood slowly, gripping the table to steady himself. "Detective Pierce," he said, forcing his voice to remain level, "do you have any proof that my mother was aware of this fraud?" Pierce shook his head. "No. In fact, my investigation suggests the opposite. Margaret Sullivan never touched the money illegally. She has been using her own funds to raise her son and cover debts left by her husband." A new kind of silence filled the courtroom. This time it was heavy with realization. Nathan felt his chest tighten. He had spent his life blaming his mother for his father's absence. He had dragged her into this court and accused her of crimes she never committed. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Sullivan, in light of this new evidence, do you wish to proceed with the charges?" Nathan looked at his mother. Margaret met his gaze, her expression neither angry nor smug, just patient. The case had turned against itself. Nathan took a deep breath and turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to request a recess." The judge nodded. "Very well. This court will reconvene in 1 hour." Nathan stepped away from the prosecutor's table, his mind spinning. He had just realized the worst mistake of his career and his life. Nathan Sullivan sat alone in the empty courtroom, elbows on the table, hands clasped in front of his mouth. The gavel had fallen. The judge had declared a recess, but the weight of the case still pressed down on him like a collapsing building. He had come into this court determined to prove his mother guilty. Instead, he had exposed a crime, one that belonged to his father. The doors creaked open, and soft footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Nathan didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Margaret Sullivan walked to the defense table and sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Nathan asked, "How long have you known?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "Since the day he left." Nathan finally looked up, anger flickering behind his exhausted eyes. "And you let me hate you for it?" Margaret held his gaze. "I let you believe what you needed to believe." Nathan clenched his fists. "I spent years thinking you were the liar, that you were the reason he was gone. And all this time you were just protecting me?" Margaret smiled sadly. "What would you have done, Nathan? If I had told you your father faked his death to escape his failures? That he left us with nothing but his debts and his name?" Nathan shook his head, his mind spinning. "I don't know," he admitted. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter. "I wasn't going to show you this," she said, sliding it across the table. "But I think you deserve to see it now." Nathan hesitated before picking it up. The envelope was yellowed with age, the ink slightly smudged. He unfolded the letter and read, "Margaret, I can't do this anymore. I've failed you. I've failed Nathan. There's no way out of this debt, except to disappear. I know you'll hate me for this. Maybe Nathan will too. But this is the only way I can give you both a future. Robert." Nathan felt his throat tighten. He left this for you?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "It was the last thing he ever gave me. No money, no plan, just an apology that came too late." Nathan closed his eyes. His father's disappearance had been an act of cowardice, not tragedy. And yet, for years, Nathan had turned that cowardice into something noble, something he could hold on to. And in doing so, he had destroyed his relationship with the only parent who had stayed. A sharp knock on the courtroom door interrupted the moment. Eleanor Carter stepped inside. "Recess is almost over," she announced, then glanced between mother and son. "Should I assume the prosecution will be dropping the case?" Nathan let out a breath. then stood. "No," he said. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "No." Nathan straightened his tie. "I won't be prosecuting my mother, but I'm not letting my father get away with this either." Margaret blinked. "Nathan," he turned to her, voice steady. "He forged documents, committed fraud, took money that wasn't his. He let you carry the burden of his mistakes while he lived freely in Mexico." Nathan picked up his case file. "This trial isn't over," he said. "I came here looking for justice. I just didn't realize I was chasing the wrong criminal." The court was about to witness the real case, the one against Robert Sullivan. Nathan would make sure of it. Nathan Sullivan walked back into the courtroom, his mind clearer than it had been since the trial began. The moment he had stepped into this court, he had believed one truth, that his mother was guilty. Now he knew how wrong he had been. As the judge entered and took his seat, the gavel struck once. "This court is now back in session. Mr. Sullivan, will the prosecution be continuing its case?" Nathan stood, buttoning his jacket. "Yes, Your Honor," but not against Margaret Sullivan. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The jury exchanged confused glances. Even Eleanor Carter, Margaret's defense attorney, raised an eyebrow. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Clarify your statement, Mr. Sullivan." Nathan picked up a file from his table. "Your Honor, new evidence has come to light. The true fraud was committed not by Margaret Sullivan, but by her husband, Robert Sullivan, who, as we now know, is alive and living under a false identity in Mexico." Gasps filled the courtroom. Eleanor Carter stood immediately. "Your Honor, in light of this new information, I formally request that all charges against my client be dropped." The judge nodded. "That seems appropriate. Does the prosecution object?" Nathan met his mother's eyes from across the courtroom. "No objections, Your Honor." The gavel struck. "Margaret Sullivan, you are hereby cleared of all charges. You are free to go." Applause rippled through the courtroom, though Margaret remained still, watching her son carefully. The judge turned back to Nathan. "And what do you intend to do now, Mr. Sullivan?" Nathan exhaled. "I request that this court issue a warrant for the arrest of Robert Sullivan on charges of insurance fraud, identity theft, and financial deception." The judge nodded. "Does the prosecution have sufficient evidence to move forward?" Nathan turned to Detective Samuel Pierce, who sat near the witness stand. Detective Pierce has compiled evidence of Robert Sullivan's fraudulent activities, including financial records, fake identification, and proof that he has been withdrawing money from offshore accounts. Pierce stood and held up a folder. "Everything is here, Your Honor." The judge reviewed the documents. His expression hardened. "Very well. This court will approve a warrant for Robert Sullivan's arrest. We will schedule a formal hearing in due course." Nathan felt a strange weight lift from his chest. He had walked into this courtroom ready to fight against his mother. Now he was fighting for justice. Margaret stood from the defense table, slowly making her way toward him. The room was still buzzing with whispers, but all Nathan could focus on was the woman in front of him. "You didn't have to do this," Margaret said softly. Nathan met her gaze. "Yes, I did." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Your father always believed he could escape his mistakes, but you faced yours head on." Nathan swallowed. "I made a mistake when I brought you into this court. I won't make the same mistake twice." Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're a good man, Nathan." For the first time in years, Nathan felt like a son again. The courtroom had been the site of a battle, but in the end, it had given them something neither had expected: the truth. And justice was just beginning. The courtroom had emptied, but Nathan Sullivan remained at the prosecutor's table, staring at the pile of legal documents before him. The charges against his mother had been dropped, but the case against his father was only beginning. Margaret Sullivan stood near the exit, watching him with quiet concern. "Nathan, you don't have to do this," she said softly. He glanced up. "Yes, I do. He got away with this for too long." Margaret sighed. stepping closer. I spent years trying to forget what he did. I moved on. You don't have to put yourself through this. Nathan shook his head. Mom, he stole money. He abandoned us. And he let you take the fall when you did nothing wrong. His jaw tightened. I won't let him escape justice again. Before Margaret could respond, Detective Samuel Pierce entered the courtroom, holding a thick file. We have a problem, he said. Nathan straightened. What kind of problem? Pierce tossed the file onto the table. Your father knows we're after him. A chill ran through Nathan. How? Pierce exhaled. One of his offshore accounts was frozen after the hearing. Someone tipped him off. He's on the move. Margaret's face paled. Where is he going? Pierce shook his head. That's the issue. We don't know. He hasn't used his usual aliases. He's disappearing again. Nathan clenched his fists. Not this time. He grabbed his briefcase and moved toward the exit, but Pierce stepped in front of him. Nathan, slow down. This is bigger than a court case now. You're dealing with a man who faked his own death once. He won't hesitate to do it again. Nathan met his gaze. That's exactly why I can't let him slip away. Pierce studied him for a moment, then sighed. Fine, but you need to do this the right way. Legally. Nathan exhaled sharply. Then what's our next move? Pierce opened the file and pointed to a document. We need a federal warrant. That'll give us the authority to track his financial movements and work with international agencies. But it won't be easy. Nathan nodded. Then let's get started. Margaret reached for his arm. Nathan, are you sure about this? He turned to her. Mom, I spent years chasing the wrong person. I need to make this right. Margaret searched his face, then finally nodded. Then I'm with you. Nathan turned back to Pierce. How long? Until we can get the warrant. Pierce checked his watch. We can file for an emergency hearing tomorrow morning, but there's no guarantee the court will approve it. Nathan set his jaw. Then I'll make sure they do. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just fighting a case, he was fighting for something personal. Robert Sullivan had run from the law once. Nathan would make sure he never ran again. The next morning, Nathan Sullivan arrived at the courthouse before sunrise. He had spent the night reviewing every legal angle, preparing arguments, and drafting the necessary motion to secure a federal warrant for Robert Sullivan's arrest. As he stepped into the courtroom, he saw Margaret already seated in the back row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She offered a small nod of encouragement, but her face held concern. Nathan knew why this was no longer just about a court case. This was about bringing down a man who had spent years perfecting the art of deception. Detective Samuel Pierce entered shortly after, a thick folder tucked under his arm. You ready for this? He asked as he sat beside Nathan at the prosecutor's table. Nathan exhaled. I have to be. Minutes later, the judge entered, and the court was called to order. Mr. Sullivan, the judge began, adjusting his glasses as he looked at Nathan. You have filed an emergency motion for a federal arrest warrant. I trust you have sufficient cause to justify this request. Nathan stood. Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution has gathered substantial evidence that Robert Sullivan is alive and has been committing financial crimes. For years, we believe he is now attempting to flee once again. The judge glanced at Detective Pierce. Detective, do you have confirmation of this? Pierce nodded and handed the judge a report. Your Honor, as of last night, Robert Sullivan withdrew $50,000 from an unregistered account in the Cayman Islands. He is liquidating assets. He knows we are coming for him. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Nathan could feel the tension building. This wasn't just a request for an arrest, it was a race against time. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. After a long pause, he finally spoke. The evidence is compelling. However, issuing a federal warrant requires more than proof of past fraud. We must prove an immediate risk of flight. Nathan nodded. Your Honor, may I present additional evidence to this court? Proceed. Nathan gestured to Pierce, who pulled out a security report. This document confirms that Robert Sullivan booked a private flight from Tijuana, Mexico, to an undisclosed location just hours after yesterday's court hearing. We believe he intends to disappear permanently. The judge studied the papers, his expression unreadable. The room fell into complete silence. Finally, the gavel struck. The court grants the federal arrest warrant for Robert Sullivan. Effective immediately, law enforcement agencies will coordinate with international authorities to locate and detain the suspect. Nathan exhaled, the weight on his chest finally lifting. He turned to Pierce. "What now?" Pierce stood. "Now we find him." As the courtroom began to empty, Margaret approached her son. "You did it," she said softly. Nathan met her gaze. "Not yet. Not until he's behind bars." Margaret hesitated before placing a hand on his arm. "Nathan, this won't bring back the years we lost." He swallowed hard. "I know, but it will make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Margaret searched his face, then finally nodded. "Then go finish this." Nathan turned and followed Pierce out of the courtroom. The chase for Robert Sullivan had begun. The moment the judge granted the federal arrest warrant, Nathan Sullivan wasted no time. He and Detective Samuel Pierce rushed out of the courtroom, moving swiftly through the courthouse halls. The real battle had only just begun. "We need to act fast," Pierce said, dialing a number as they stepped outside. "If Robert Sullivan gets on that plane, we'll lose him again." Nathan nodded, gripping his phone. "I'll call the Department of Justice and notify the International Task Force. If he's still in Tijuana, we have a chance to intercept him before he disappears." Margaret had followed them out, her expression tight with worry. "Nathan, are you sure about this?" He turned to his mother, his voice steady. "Yes. He ran once. I won't let him do it again." Margaret sighed, but didn't argue. "Just be careful." Pierce lowered his phone. "Interpol is on alert. Mexican authorities are watching the private airstrip. But we still don't know exactly where he is." Nathan thought for a moment. His father was smart. He wouldn't use any traceable accounts unless absolutely necessary. Then it hit him. "He has a contact," Nathan said suddenly. Pierce frowned. "What do you mean?" Nathan turned to his mother. "Mom, when Dad was involved in his business dealings, did he ever mention someone he trusted? Someone outside the system?" Margaret hesitated. "There was a man, Hector Ramirez. He helped Robert with offshore investments. But I haven't heard that name in years." Nathan's mind raced. If Robert is trying to escape, he'll need money. And if Hector was involved in handling his finances before, he might be his only option now. Pierce immediately started making calls. "I'll get the local authorities to check any known locations Ramirez operates in." Nathan checked his watch. "We don't have much time." The wait was unbearable. Nathan paced outside the courthouse, phone in hand, refreshing the updates from the authorities. Finally, Pierce's phone buzzed. He answered, listened for a moment, then turned to Nathan. "They found him," Pierce said. "Robert Sullivan is at a small hotel near the airstrip. He's waiting for a signal from his contact before moving to the plane." Nathan felt adrenaline surge through his veins. "Let's go." Pierce grabbed his keys. "The Mexican authorities will handle the arrest, but we're going to be there when it happens." Nathan hesitated. "And if he runs?" Pierce gave him a sharp look. "Then we make sure he doesn't get far." By the time they arrived, the sun was beginning to set over the city. The small hotel where Robert Sullivan was staying looked unremarkable, just another faded building among many. But inside, Nathan knew, was the man who had torn his family apart. A group of officers stood nearby, waiting for the signal. Pierce spoke quickly with their lead contact before nodding toward Nathan. "This is it," Pierce said. "Once they move in, it's over." Nathan's heart pounded. He watched as the officers surrounded the building. Then a sudden movement. A man bolted from the back entrance, sprinting toward an alley. "It's him!" Nathan shouted. "Pierce didn't hesitate. He," and the officers took off after Robert Sullivan. Nathan followed close behind, his legs burning as he ran. His father was fast. But this time, he wouldn't escape. Nathan Sullivan had never run this fast in his life. The streets of Tijuana blurred around him as he chased the shadowy figure ahead, his father, Robert Sullivan. Robert weaved through the alley, knocking over crates and pushing past pedestrians in a desperate attempt to escape. Nathan heard Pierce and the officers shouting commands behind him, but he didn't slow down. He wasn't a lawyer anymore. He wasn't a prosecutor standing in a courtroom arguing over documents. This wasn't about a trial. This was personal. Robert glanced back, his face a mixture of panic and determination. He saw Nathan closing in. He turned sharply, ducking into a narrow alley. Nathan followed without thinking. For a moment, all Nathan could hear was his own heartbeat. Then, out of nowhere, a hand grabbed his arm. Nathan barely had time to react before Robert spun him around and shoved him against the brick wall. "Stay out of this, Nathan," Robert hissed. Nathan gritted his teeth. "You think you can run forever?" Robert's eyes darted around. "You have no idea what you're getting into." Nathan shoved him back. "No, Dad. You have no idea what you did to us." Robert hesitated. For a brief second, Nathan saw something flicker in his father's expression: guilt, regret. But just as quickly it was gone. "I did what I had to do," Robert said. "You'll understand one day." Nathan shook his head. "No, I won't." Footsteps thundered behind them. Pierce and the officers rounded the corner, guns raised. Robert Sullivan, hands in the air. Robert turned, his body tensing as if he was about to run again. "Don't," Nathan warned. "It's over." Robert exhaled sharply, glancing around one last time. Then, finally, he raised his hands. An officer stepped forward, cuffing his wrists. "Robert Sullivan, you are under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and fleeing the court of law." Robert didn't resist. He just looked at Nathan one last time. "I never wanted this," Robert murmured. Nathan met his gaze, his voice firm. "Neither did we." The officers led Robert away, disappearing into the flashing lights of the waiting patrol cars. Nathan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Pierce clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Sullivan." Nathan let out a long breath. "Yeah," he said, though he wasn't sure how he felt. 2 days later, Nathan stood once again in a courtroom, but this time he wasn't the one arguing. He sat next to Margaret as they watched Robert Sullivan being formally charged. His father sat quietly, listening as the charges were read. "The defendant, Robert Sullivan, is charged with multiple counts of fraud, falsifying documents, and obstruction of justice," the judge announced. Nathan didn't look away. He had chased the truth, and now justice was finally being served. Margaret reached over and took Nathan's hand. "It's over," she whispered. Nathan nodded. For the first time in years, he believed it. The gavel struck. The court had spoken. The air in the courtroom felt heavier than usual. This time, Nathan Sullivan wasn't standing at the prosecutor's table, arguing for justice. He was sitting beside his mother, Margaret, as they watched his father, Robert Sullivan, face the consequences of his own choices. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at Robert, who sat handcuffed in the defendant's chair. "Robert Sullivan, you are charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead?" For a long moment, Robert didn't answer. He looked tired, more tired than Nathan had ever seen him. The man who had once been larger than life, the father Nathan had idolized as a child, now seemed small and broken. Finally, Robert exhaled. "Guilty, Your Honor." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Nathan felt his chest tighten. He had prepared himself for a fight, for a plea deal, for another desperate lie. But hearing his father finally admit the truth, That was something he hadn't expected. The judge nodded. Given the severity of these charges, and the fact that the defendant fled from justice for years, this court will not be lenient. Mr. Sullivan, you will serve 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole. The gavel struck. This court is adjourned. The decision was final. It was over. Nathan let out a slow breath, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench. He had chased this moment for so long: justice, truth, accountability. But now that it was here, it didn't feel as satisfying as he had imagined. Robert turned in his seat to look at him. For the first time in years, father and son locked eyes. "I'm sorry," Robert said, his voice hoarse. Nathan studied him, searching for sincerity. Maybe it was there, buried beneath years of selfish choices. Maybe it wasn't. It didn't matter anymore. "You're too late," Nathan said simply. Robert didn't argue. He just nodded, as if he already knew. 2 officers escorted him out of the courtroom, leaving Nathan and Margaret sitting in the now empty space. Margaret placed a hand over Nathan's. "How do you feel?" Nathan thought about it. He thought about the years of resentment, the accusations, the blind loyalty to a father who had never deserved it. He thought about the moment he had walked into this court, ready to take his mother down, only to discover that she had been protecting him all along. And now? "Free," he said finally. Margaret smiled. "Me too." They stood, walking out of the courtroom side by side. For the first time in years, they weren't leaving with unanswered questions or hidden truths. For the first time, they were truly moving forward. Justice isn't always a straight path. Sometimes, the truth hides where we least expect it. Nathan Sullivan entered the courtroom seeking one answer, but left with a completely different truth, one that changed everything. This story reminds us that the past can shape us, but it doesn't have to define us. No matter how many mistakes are made, accountability always catches up in the end. What did you think of the case? Would you have done what Nathan did? Let us know in the comments. And before you go, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another gripping story. See you in the next one.